Hi, this is Scott Douglas, contributing writer for Runner's World and running book author, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Physiocrem and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll aim to bring you a range of episodes, including featured performers, interest editions, coaches' corners, and expert editions. Recently, we've featured a range of expert editions before last week returning to featured performer, Ironman triathlon champion Braden Carey. This week, we return to an interest edition featuring veteran running, fitness and health journalist, former senior editor of Runner's World magazine, current Runner's World online contributor, and best-selling author Scott Douglas. Scott Douglas is the author of 6 fantastic running books, including The Little Red Book of Running, Advanced Marathoning with Pete Pfitzinger, Meb for Mortals, and 26 marathons with none other than episode 165 featured performer US Great Meb Keflezighi. And most recently, Scott gave birth to the book that he'd been wanting to write for more than 2 decades, Running is My Therapy. Subtitled Relieve Stress and Anxiety, Fight Depression, Ditch Bad Habits, and Live Happier. Now come on, who would not want to pick up a book with that subtitle? And any runner on the planet can attest that running really is our therapy. Scott himself is a lifelong runner, having clocked more than 110,000 miles on his running odometer. And on today's episode, Scott takes us behind the scenes of what it takes to produce a book like Running is My Therapy. The hours of research, the hours of preparation, the hours of labour. Scott also openly shares his own struggles throughout his life with low-grade depression, and the fascinating story of how Scott came to realise that he needed to seek assistance. If you've ever wondered why you feel so good after a run, or conversely, why you feel so miserable, irritated, or frustrated when you are unable to run, then this is an episode you are going to really enjoy. We discuss all things running for anxiety, depression, and mood, and the science that underpins just what is happening. Get ready with a pen and paper. Here is my conversation with best-selling author, Runner's World contributor, Scott Douglas. Scott Douglas, this is a real thrill for me as someone that appreciates good running literature. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks for having me.
Scott, your working life has been extensive around all things running and writing. Can you paint a little bit of picture in terms of leading up to the release of Running is My Therapy, which is the focus of today's conversation, but can you please paint a little bit of a picture of your working life? There's Runner's World and Running Times formerly.
Right. I've been doing this for 25-ish years now. Some aspect of running, writing, and running editing. You mentioned the 2 publications that I've had the strongest connections with. Unfortunately, Running Times no longer exists. So I'm now currently a contributing writer for Runner's World here in the States, working entirely on the website and both writing and editing. And I also have written or co-written several running books going back over the last 20 years and the last however many years, a handful of years, I've somehow had a resurgence in in my productivity and have been responsible for a number of books over the past several years.
And I'm going to name each of those books because they're all wonderful in their own right. But what's led to this resurgence of activity?
I wrote a book in 2011, that Little Red Book of Running, came out in 2011, and I things just started to snowball from there. The cliche is the reward for a job well done is more work, and that seems to be what has happened in my case, whether the work was done well or not. But it's nice having sort of a balance professionally of like these longer term projects and then sort of the day-to-day type stuff.
And I may have the chronology out of order here, Scott, but Advanced Marathoning with Pete Pfitzinger, Meb for Mortals, How to Run, Think and Eat Like a Champion Marathoner with obviously Meb Keflezighi, and then more recently 26 Marathons with Meb Keflezighi, who we recently featured, and what a brilliant piece that was. So congratulations.
Thank you. It's easy with a co-author like that,
Such a great story and a book that had to be written, I think, for a career like that. In working with Meb, what's one thing that stood out in working with Meb, Scott? You've done 2 publications together.
It's one thing that was surprising in a sort of like really kind of way, and then one thing that, a more helpful thing. So the surprising thing was when we were working on Meb for Mortals, he gave me access to his, GPS data and stuff. And I could see from on individual runs that he's the sort of person who he thinks in terms of miles, not kilometers. But so if he got to an end of a run and his GPS said 9.88 miles, then he's the sort of guy who, runs out and back to get it to exactly 10.00. And I was sort of like, really? Wow, you're supposed to be, I don't know. It just seemed like that's not the sort of thing that somebody like that should do, but what do I know? The more helpful thing was the sort of this idea that there's always something that you can improve on. So in my case, I'm 55, I've been running for 40 years, I'm well past being able to set personal records, but I can always improve on my current abilities in various areas, including, sort of mental strength. And so that was a real sort of good lesson that I took away from both of the books that we worked on. The idea that wherever you're at, even if you're never going to run as fast as you used to, you could be better than you currently are today, and there's something that you can work on. Try to find what those things are and then find a reasonable way to go about making those improvements.
And I think that's such a noble pursuit. I'm a healthcare practitioner, a sports physio in Australia, and I love seeing people view their exercise, in this case running, as a lifelong endeavour.
Yeah.
Even if their performances, they may not hit personal bests or PRs. However, there's so much to be gained from that. So well done, Scott and Meb, on bringing that to light. That there's so much in that, and I love seeing professionals who continue to compete and race. I think that just speaks to all of us.
Yeah.
Scott, in reading and unpacking Running Is My Therapy, what a fantastic book. The subtitle being Relieve Stress and Anxiety, Fight Depression, Ditch Bad Habits and Live Happier. Who would not want to pick that book up?
Yeah.
And Scott, I've been on the Audible version, getting out, exercising and ingesting the contents, so to speak. There's something that I think really has just jumped out at me. And if you're happy to share your own journey in what I believe was in researching for this book, you had a bit of an insight into your own psychological status. Can you take us through that insight that you learn about yourself, but also the driving force for what has been, I'm sure, hours and hours and hours in bringing this book to light?
This is the book that I long wanted to write because I thought that there are a lot of people like me who, whatever their other reasons for running, value running for the sort of bolster that it gives to their mental health. I kept waiting for such a book to be written. Nobody was writing that book sort of from the runner's viewpoint. There were some other books that are sort of more from a practitioner standpoint, and there's some running, but some more sort of general exercise. But there wasn't anything that was sort of like, what it's like to live this, like to be a runner who benefits on the mental health status from being a regular runner. And so I wanted to write that book for other people like me, so that they could sort of maybe have a better understanding of why this activity is so enticing to them and why they sort of intuitively feel that that they're doing the right thing. I wanted to try to show the science behind what we all sort of intuitively grasp. It was great. I really appreciate the opportunity to have written that book.
And there is plenty of science in there, but it's presented in a way that's a compelling read, or in my case, listen. You know, it's not like reading a scientific journal. You really pull it out and bring it to life. And your own journey, Scott, I mean, you said you've been running for 40 years. As a teenager, you know, you cite in Running Is My Therapy that you suffered from low-grade depression really your whole life, and then you realised that, I guess, running was part of your medication.
Correct. I started running when I was 15, and that's about the same time that, you know, sort of what I now recognize as sort of a given in my life sort of crystallized and really took up residence. And so I feel so lucky to have made that discovery of running at that time. I have talked to tons of people who struggled with depression much more than I have, and then found running. Not that running cured their depression or anxiety, but they learned how to better manage it and not have it, you know, sort of detract from their life so much. I feel very fortunate that I happened upon running at around, you know, at that age when I didn't have to go through like up to age 30 of you know, really struggling with that. I've never been somebody who like couldn't get off the couch. I've never been somebody who couldn't go to work for a week or anything like that. And part of that, a large part of that, is because of this daily pull of running. Like, okay, I know if I can get myself out the door, then even just 20 or 30 minutes, I'm going to feel like I wasn't completely defeated that day. And so when I've talked to other people who discovered running later in life, you know, they had a much harder time of it because they had those 10 or 15 years maybe where they couldn't get off the couch for a week at a time. I attribute my ability to sort of live what from the outside seems a normal, productive life to like having discovered running at such an early age.
Oh, gosh, so much there. I certainly see it in my professional work, you know, the effects that the activity, in this case running, is having for people. And I really see it on those that, you know, may not be clinically depressed, but sort of signs that they're somewhere on that continuum. And then those that are, you know, anxious, pathological anxiety, if you like. And I self-reflect, Scott. I self-selected into junior triathlon, a fairly arduous endeavour, at 11 years of age. And certainly my bloodline is wired towards anxiety. And then when I couldn't do it, I realised that I was a bit of a mess, and I'd lost my medication, which was that get up in the morning, give yourself a good session, and you'd feel a bit calmer for the day. So I certainly, echo with it your own reflections there, that you reflected and realised how you just happened to stumble onto something that was so life-sustaining. So I think it's a beautiful story. And Scott, you're right, running became a dependable source of pleasure and relief that, partly by providing structure to my days, always provided something to look forward to. I knew I'd finally found a way to make life more livable, run by run, day by day.
The structure part of it, for me, you know, I now can look back in retrospect, but the sort of the structure that running provides, or any sort of regular exercise, you know, where you're sort of goal oriented, having that structure for me when I was in my teens, and sort of having sort of classic cliche, what is the point of everything thoughts, running, at least I could say like, well, I don't know what the point of existence is, but I know tomorrow I'm going to do a workout, you know, and so that means today I'm going to run easy. That sort of structure that's built into running really appealed to me, and I think helped me sort of not get mired down to the extent I would have been by these sort of like, what is the point type thoughts. And running, I try to make the argument in the book that running, no offense to triathletes, but that running is, sort of perhaps uniquely effective. And I think one reason is because, you know, you can more or less run every day wherever you are in the world, in normal circumstances, and so it sort of rewards that daily activity or regularity in a way that maybe, you know, if you're a cyclist and it's pouring rain, well, you're not so much in the habit of like, well, it doesn't matter what the weather is, I'm going to go out anyway. So running, because of its convenience, rewards that regularity, which then I think for people who sort of are looking for help with finding meaning in their day-to-day existence, helps with that by the structure that running can provide.
And, you know, the term you reference in running is my therapy is self-efficacy, that ability to feel like you've got some degree of control in a world that otherwise feels like, these existential crises and everything else. It's just something that you can do, right? That you feel good about.
Yeah, and then seeing that, I and many others can then say, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm not viewing other things accurately. Maybe I can make progress in work or in school or in relationships. I have this regular daily evidence that I'm the sort of person who can get up off the couch and get something done. It's quite logical to think then I can do that in other areas of my life. And again, if you didn't have this one thing that's sort of giving you this daily evidence of like, oh, I'm the sort of person who isn't completely defeated by my mental health, hopefully you can then sort of apply that thinking in other parts of your life.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a runner on the planet that can't attest to that, Scott. Scott, you said that this book had been the book that you had wanted to bring to light for years. Was there a catalyst that occurred that made you go, right, this is the year I'm going to sit down and start this?
Yes and no. I got tired of not doing it. I sort of gave myself the goal of get a deal to write this book. There wasn't like one day or anything, although I do have a distinct memory of a couple years earlier, I was reading the Sunday New York Times book review, and I'm not one to throw books across the room, but I threw the book review across the room because I was just so frustrated with the idea that I was never going to write like this book that I wanted to write. I guess a couple years later, I got fed up enough on a sort of regular basis that I made that one of my goals for the year. I set goals for myself every year, and I made that a goal for the upcoming year, was to get a book contract for this book.
And in terms of writing time, researching time, what was the time frame for that? I think it's always interesting to get behind the cover of the book and go, well, actually, here's what I read. It might take me 6 hours to listen to or X amount of hours to read. But this took what was the research timeline?
Well, setting aside my life, the actual between when I turned the manuscript in about a year after I signed a contract to write the book. The latter half of that year was that was my main focus in that time. I started working on it earlier, lots of interviews and stuff. So the research part was sort of more the first half of the year of that 12-month period. And then the sort of writing part was more toward the end of that. It was much more draining in a good way than like other books that I've written, just because it was so much more personal than most of the things that I've written. And I just felt this obligation to my fellow runners to try to do it the best I could. I cut back on other work and really tried to do something that I hoped would resonate with my fellow runners in a way that's different than for a 5K, run kilometer repeats type stuff, which is important and important to get right. But there was sort of another layer of meaning underneath this book.
And I think what you said at the top of our time here, Scott, is that intuitively everyone knows that they're psychologically probably a bit better off when they do run, but no one had ever taken the time to pull together this disparate bunch of papers out there in the science into something that, unless you're a practitioner or a scientist reading journals, you're not going to go and look for that, but you're going to pick up a book like yours and better understand it, which can only further drive behaviours. So well done. Scott, we want to dive into the contents of the book, but what's been some of the most surprising feedback you've had since you authored it and its release in 2018? Surprising has been the number of people who, not the number of people who have said, oh, this really resonated with me, but the number of people who I knew through various ways who then only after writing this book that I hear from them that, this is something that they too have had mental health struggles, and they too have, benefited from using running to help boost their mental health. So it was surprising just in terms of, runners, we tend to be so open about so many things that in this century that people are still somehow, for some reason, feel the need to be maybe a little guarded about this, like you would never say like, oh, I don't want people to know that I have that my left hamstring's weaker than my right, people should do what they want. I was surprised by the number of people who I knew
who then said, "Oh, this really spoke to me." And I didn't know before that we had this thing in common. I thought they were, competitive racers and they ran to race only, and all this sort of stuff. So that was surprising.
Let's talk about the scope of it. There's lots of statistics and papers, etc., that you cite in the book, but one that jumped out to me, and I'd be interested in other facts and statistics that jumped out to you, was that in terms of depression, the World Health Organization states it as the leading cause of disability and poor health, and yet 3% of government spend typically goes towards it. So can you paint a bit more of a picture in terms of the scope, the size of anxiety, depression and mental illness in society from your research?
I think in the United States, I think the figure is that up to 20% of people will have some sort of anxiety disorder at some point in their life, and somewhere, sorry, I don't have the stats right on the top of my head, but it was somewhere between like 10 and 15% will, be affected enough by depression at some point in their life to, to sort of have it affect their quality of life. So that's a lot of people. And of course, there's people who have coexistence, depression and anxiety. I'm fortunate in that I don't seem to have any tendencies toward anxiety. Anyway, that's a lot of people. And because it's not talked about still in the way that other conditions are talked about, that's why maybe like something like the World Health Organization claim about it being the leading cause of disability might be like, oh, really? But if you said there was some condition that, 10 to 20% of the people have that can be debilitating, then you would say, yeah, of course, that makes sense that it would be along the, that would be the leading cause of disability. But because we still don't tend to talk about it as openly, maybe that's why that's a surprising stat.
Yeah, and how many more people are affected that we aren't aware of?
So who might not even want to admit it or want to, even if they were to take a screening, answer the questions honestly. I don't know.
I was intrigued when with your own self-discovery, if I joined the dots together, Scott, that you were researching Alberto Salazar's depression and his quick turnaround once he was prescribed Prozac within 3 days. Yeah. And you were looking at the symptoms, the signs and symptoms of depression, and you went, well, doesn't everyone feel like that? Because that had been your lifelong modus operandi. So that must have been a bit of a moment, yeah? Yeah,
that was very cool. So that was when Alberto resurfaced out of nowhere and won the Comrades Marathon. What year was that? 1993. And then he attributed his sort of physical turnaround to going on Prozac. And that was at the same time there was a very popular book in the United States called Listening to Prozac by a psychiatrist. So there was starting to be some discussion about it. And like you said, I was working on this article about sort of, whoa, where did Alberto Salazar come from? And this angle came up. And when I was talking with him about some of his symptoms at that time, and I was like, as you said, I was like, well, yeah, of course. So it doesn't everybody feel this way, and sort of realized like, oh, okay, I guess not. And then I, then looked back on, with the feelings I had started to have maybe 12 or 13 years before that as a teenager, started piecing things together, and then went to a psychiatrist and I was prescribed medication like that day, which isn't necessarily a good thing for any one medication. But I just say that to, in my mind, he was like, there's no doubt that this is something I had been living with for a long time. Have you connected with Alberto in over the years since you had that self-reflection, realization from Alberto's story and obviously then your ongoing professional work in the industry? Have Alberto and yourself connected on this? Not on this, no. We've had a couple exchanges over the years, but we operate pretty independently. Yeah, no, sure. And Scott, chapters 2, 3 and 4, how running helps people with depression, how running helps people with anxiety, and how to use running to improve your mood. I don't think there's anyone on the planet, is or isn't a runner, that wouldn't want to actually understand those things better because of what you said. Running is perhaps the most convenient form of exercise, and then the fact that this can be so beneficial for our mental health
makes it a convenient form of medication in my mind. So how can running help people with depression? Now, I know this is hours and hours of work and pages, but in short, how can running help people with depression?
I would say there's three main things. So, we tend to think of depression, especially because of the prevalence of antidepressant medication, we tend to think of it as a brain, in terms of brain chemistry only. Certainly very important. The book details the overwhelming evidence of how running, regular exercise, primarily aerobic, but it can be resistance, results in the regular release of feel-good brain chemicals, and that's, everybody sort of intuitively knows that, right? I go out for a run, I'm in a better mood. Everybody sort of endorphins. There are other brain chemicals, endocannabinoids, which are sort of the body's, that's the thing that the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana acts upon. Brain-derived neurotropic factor is another feel-good chemical that is released when you exercise. So there's sort of a daily brain chemistry hit, and then there's the more important thing, there's sort of a structural change in the brain from regular exercise. So growth in the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which tends to be shrunken in people with depression, and then sort of better wiring between parts of the brain. So that's part one. That's the brain chemistry. Part two, we've talked about already, this idea of self-efficacy, sort of a psychological aspect of I'm not defeated by this. I can get things done. So those two things are really key. I would also later in the book talk about some of the sort of side aspects of running, things that are sort of built into the structure of running. And one of them would be social connections. People with depression tend to feel isolated, and running, provides this sort of built-in way to build and maintain strong social connections. Especially, like I've said, I'm 55. Most people who are 55 aren't making lots of new friends all the time, but I have a means to, And then in terms of depression, another key thing I think is this idea of activation, which, you would talk about in your work, I'm sure, right? There's something for someone who's depressed, getting activated, sort of instead of going out and spending some energy, leaves you more energized rather than more tired once you get the basic level of fitness, right? For depression, for anxiety, there's sort of this flip side. Someone who's particularly anxious sort of gets the opposite, right? So you get this calming effect of regular exercise. So for someone who's really depressed, the running has this paradoxical accomplishment of making you more energized by going out and doing something active. And for somebody who is anxious, it has the sort of flip side of feel calmer now, I'm not on edge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I sort of lightheartedly refer to it as the sedative, the medication. And you take that away from a runner or an athlete, anyone who has learnt, often without awareness or reflection, that this is part of their equilibrium maintaining in life through injury, which is my professional work in life. I really see the impact that it has on them. I often say, Scott, in my work, people don't come in the door because they're in pain with their knee. They come in the door because of the frustrations, the fears, the anxieties, their mental disturbance that gets to them. Right. So it's really evident in my work what your work has just summarized.
Yeah, because that knee injury is going to be the one that's going to end their career, right?
Of course.
Even though they've gotten over every injury they've ever had before, this is the one. Yeah.
You're listening to Scott Douglas, best-selling author and author of Running is My Therapy. Relieve stress and anxiety, fight depression, ditch bad habits, and live happier. On this, an interest edition of the Physical Performance Show. Support for today's show comes from PhysioCrem. PhysioCrem is a topical massage cream containing natural plant-based ingredients, ideal for the temporary relief of muscular aches and pains. If you're conscious of what you put on your body, you'll be happy to know that PhysioCrem does not contain parabens or hydroxybenzoates, and its non-greasy formula doesn't leave any sticky residue behind. Physio Creme can be found Australia-wide at your local Coles, chemist or health store, as well as their online shop. They've even offered a 20% discount to listeners of the Physical Performance Show by simply using the coupon code POGO, P-O-G-O, when you're online at the physiocrem.com.au store. That's FISIOCREM.com.au. Hurting Sucks and Physio Creme have got your back. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. Our philosophy is very simple. We do not wish to see you for a single session more than what you need or a single session less. We exist to help you simply get back to your physical best. To find out more about Pogo Physio's unique and award-winning services, or to find out more about our telehealth services whereby we help people worldwide and interstate inside Australia, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back on this interest edition with best-selling author, Runner's World magazine contributor, and author of Running Is My Therapy on this interest edition. I just thought it's so fascinating and wonderful that there's structural changes in the brain.
Yes.
It's not just chemical, there's structural changes. Unbelievable.
Right. Yeah, and from a cynical, unbelievable point, like it's unbelievable that like I didn't know that before I started writing this book. That was like a really important thing that I learned writing this book. At least here in the States, that's not something that your average general practitioner tells you, probably doesn't even know, that this can cause the same changes in the brain that is thought to be behind the effectiveness of antidepressant medication. You just don't hear that, at least over here.
And there's a recent publication that came out of the British Journal of Sports Medicine, Scott, which looked at graduating UK medical students in their final year and how much time they had on physical activity benefits, and I think it was maybe 10% of the curriculum, if that.
Oh, that's
that's high. And they were all asking for more lifestyle medicine education and ability to talk to people about that. So if you take that, perhaps there's not a lot of time being spent there, and then the fact that what you just said, isn't most likely well recognised at all. We can see there's a real way to go with getting this message out there.
I have talked to somebody who researched U.S. med schools, and I think, most people get one class in exercise during med school here in the States, which is obviously far below 10%.
Yeah. Scott, the obvious questions are how much, when, and what time of day. I was interested that you had plumbed a bit into those questions through your work.
Yeah.
So can you speak to some key principles around how much? Is any run a good run, or are there runs that can be more effective in terms of mood, anxiety, depression, etc.?
Yeah, any run is a good run. Any run that exists is better than a run that doesn't happen, assuming that you haven't told them not to run till their knee is better. But I mean, if you're biomechanically sound, yeah, any run on that day is better than not running in terms of helping your mental health. I'm not lately, but I have had days in the not so recent past where like I go out and do 2 miles because I'm having a tough day, but I know that 2 miles will be better than if I run 0 miles that day. In terms of the science of like what people report in terms of improved mood and the release of the brain chemicals that we were talking about earlier, half hour to an hour is, a sweet spot. And that's, what a lot of people sort of go out and do regardless of whatever they're training for or whatever their motivation to run is, I mean, half hour to an hour is sort of like a typical average person's run. That's a good amount, and that, half hour to an hour in my case, and I think in a lot of people's case, will then improve the other 23 hours in the day. When, of course, the answer is always whenever you're going to most likely to do it. That said, a lot of people I talked to for the book, both with depression and anxiety, found that the morning was on the whole more helpful, not just because of the greater chance that that they'll do it that day, rather than once the day has more of a chance to get away from them. But because it sort of sets them up mentally for the day, in the case of somebody with anxiety, sort of like calms them in a way so that then sort of a good part of their workday, they're feeling not like they would if they hadn't run beforehand. And in terms of somebody with depression, back to this idea of sort of activation, you sort of like, okay, I'm more energized for the day, sort of more have a rosier outlook on the day ahead instead of just like, oh God, what else do I have to do today, sort of stuff.
Yeah, and then where. So thank you, Scott. There's some great information there, and one of my favourite lines, it was beat inertia. Any run is better than no run.
Yeah,
I thought that was brilliant. And the other one I really liked was the best run for mood boosts equals, as you say, the run that occurs.
Right.
So that's the how much and the when. The where. Yeah. I think anyone that's ever run alongside water appreciates there's something about it. It's like there's an effect of the water being nearby, be it the ocean, a river, a dam, a lake. But you actually cited some literature on that. So what jumps out and what should we know about where to run?
So this is, in an ideal world, we would all run in the forest every day, and then the forest we'd briefly the forest and be along water, right, and have a water view for a while. Here in the States, there's like a big green exercise is now becoming talked about a lot more. There is evidence showing sort of greater relaxation, sort of brain activity associated with meditation and calmness that occurs when we're in nature rather than certainly on a treadmill or running down a busy city street. So think about when people go to a city, runners are traveling, they go to a city, they sort of like, we all sort of naturally flock to like, is there a bike path along the water, right? Or is there a loop in that little park, And I'd rather go do a 5-minute loop in this little park than like run down the big, fight my way down these big city streets, because you can sort of get in that meditative state a lot easier than running in, urban settings or whatever. So there's a fair amount of research showing that the more often that you could be in a natural setting, probably the more pleasant that you'll find it, which would then, of course, motivate you to do it again and, sort of build and build and build on your successes.
You're listening to best-selling author Scott Douglas sharing around his most recent book, Running is My Therapy, a must-read for any runner on the planet. If you missed last week's episode, it was a featured performer episode featuring dual Asia-Pacific Ironman triathlon champion Braden Currie. Here's a little snippet of what you missed.
The Coast to Coast to me was such an iconic New Zealand event that, I guess running 2:39 off the bike and getting to run by Gomez for experience that I'll probably never forget, and it's one that gave me a lot of confidence, I guess, in Ironman, that I have a run that competes with the world's best.
To tune into the full episode 175, featuring Braden Currie, simply jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from. And whilst there, be sure to check out the archives, including other featured performer episodes, interest editions, coaches' corners, and also the many and very popular expert editions, designed to share with you the highs, lows, and learnings of the world's best sports and physical performance talent, and also experts in their chosen field. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, none other than Scott Douglas, best-selling author and author of Running is My Therapy. Scott, I sometimes hear criticism of runners that you're obsessed, can't you have a day off, you're addicted, as a negative. However, I think this book really speaks to the fact that it may just be people's lifeline, either recognised or not recognised for the individual. What are your thoughts around some of that negative talk that you do hear from sometimes non-runners about runners seeming addiction?
So I try to think of addiction as like something that you started to do to solve a problem that then becomes its own problem. And certainly there are people who I'm sure that you work with people who keep running when they shouldn't be, right? From a biomechanical standpoint. From a psychological standpoint, I think that's non-runners looking for a way to feel better about the fact that they are sedentary. It's easy to point to a lot of things like bad behaviors and say, yeah, I can see where this person's addiction ruined her or his life, right? Alcohol, betting, things like that. I can't think of a lot of people whose lives have been ruined because of their recreational running regularity. I don't want to sound like everybody should run as much as possible. And certainly people can get sort of carried away with it, both in terms of keeping running when they're hurt and sort of maybe not tending to other parts of their lives because of their running. But I think for the most part, the problem in our society isn't that too many people are too active, right? It's the opposite.
No, well said. Scott, out of everything you've learnt in your professional work in life to date and your 40 years plus as a runner, a lifelong runner who is still out there trying to perfect the craft, which I think, as I said at the start, a beautiful, noble initiative. If you could issue one piece of advice to listeners of this show to help them perform at their own physical best, what would that solitary piece of advice be, Scott?
Okay, this is probably not universal because there would be some people who have done this, but I think most recreational runners have never given themselves the chance to see how good they can be. And by that I mean, getting tired for a couple of weeks when you're up to your mileage doesn't mean that you are overtrained. I think most people are in shape to get in shape. You hear stories of people, so a woman runs her first marathon in 3:40 and, which is a great time, of course. But eventually, gets motivated and eventually finds out that she's actually a 2:45 marathoner. Most people set limits on what they can achieve in running without having put in the work to see if that really is what their potential is. Of course, people should do what they want, but it's a wonderful feeling to think that you got very close to your potential in any endeavor, but in running especially. I say this in part because I feel like I got pretty close to my potential in terms of my race times 25 years ago, because I was not ever very talented or anything, but I ran a decent amount, in part because I was self-medicating and got to like, wow, I sort of, was surprised that I was able to run times that I did, based on like what I ran as a high schooler. And it was great just to think that I probably got pretty close to what I'm capable of. And that's a great feeling in life. And because of the objectivity that can be part of running, It's easy to get that measure in a way that is more difficult in other parts of our lives.
Give yourself the chance to be the best you can be. And I think time's the quintessential ingredient there. Yeah. I think we all take short time frames. I think that old adage, we underestimate what we can do over 10 years, but we overestimate what we can do in a season or a year, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Scott, every guest of the Physical Performance Show issues the listeners with a challenge for the week, a physical challenge. What is Scott Douglas's physical challenge to the listeners going to be?
Have one run this week where you leave your watch at home, or you don't have to leave your watch at home, but don't look at it, and don't run by feel, and run as far and as fast as you want to run on that day, and then look at your data afterwards and just see what the deal is, see what it is. And I say that as a sort of initiation into learning to run by feel as a general concept, instead of picking it up or whatever, picking up the pace because your watch has beeped at you, because you're going, slower than you're supposed to. Right?
That's a brilliant one. The lost art of, in some ways, the lost art of running by feel.
Yes.
In this data-driven world.
Yes.
Scott, if we want to find out more about yourself, your chronology of work, pick up a copy of Running Is My Therapy, which I encourage every runner on the planet to do. Perhaps the cheapest investment you'll make in your own good health. Where can we find out more about yourself, Scott, and obviously the publications?
I have a website, so it's my name.biz, www.scottdouglas.biz. You can also find all my books on Amazon. If you Google Scott Douglas Runner's World, then you'll find my Runner's World author page, which will have tons of working life, my daily work articles there.
Thank you, Scott. And Scott, I just want to say thank you as someone that's been around running and endurance sport my whole professional life and junior athletic years. Thank you for your contribution and the vulnerability and the discipline and dedication it took to bring this to light, because I think it's a bit of a piece of work that needed to be written and hadn't yet been put together. So thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it. Another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I know and I trust that you've enjoyed this episode. Now, this is an incredibly important topic. Mental health and wellness, whilst getting a lot of airplay, seemingly in today's society, still has a long way to go. So please, my plea with you this week is, if you know someone in your world who would enjoy, or more importantly, benefit from this episode, then please share the link with them. That would mean an incredible lot to myself and, of course, the author and featured guest, Scott Douglas. With regards to Running is My Therapy, I recommend that is a book that every runner on the planet must read. It really does reinforce the key drivers of why we feel so good when we run, and conversely, why we don't when we're not running. Education really is key, so please do whatever it takes to get the publication in your hands or in your earbuds. Audible is how I enjoyed Scott's publication. Please also reach out to Scott Douglas. You'll find Scott's handles and best contacts over on the Pogo Physio show notes for this episode, episode 176. If you would like to subscribe to the Physical Performance Show, then simply hit subscribe from within your favorite podcast player. That is the best way to help the show grow. Massive thanks to those folk who have been leaving reviews and ratings over on iTunes. This week, a big shout out to show listener LP6, who commented, "Thanks, Brad, for all the consistent and informative info you provide in the show and the amazing guests that appear. It's a great show for both listening and gleaning helpful tips for improving performance." 5 stars. Well, thank you for taking the time to leave that review. Reviews really are rocket fuel for myself in continuing to bring this show to you each and every week. As are podsies, they are a whole lot of fun. Simply take a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying and tag the show in over on Instagram at Physical Performance Show, plus or minus myself at Brad_beer. A massive thanks to the good folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Walding on all things graphic design, and Oliver Crossley, all things behind the scenes. Another massive thank you to today's show sponsor, PhysioCrem. Podcasts are free to download and enjoy. However, they are not free to produce. So PhysioCrem, your contribution is greatly appreciated. Be sure to jump over and enjoy the PhysioCrem 20% off discount for you, the listener of this show. physiocrem.com.au. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump over to an expert edition featuring UK-based leading sports podiatrist and industry influencer, Ian Griffiths. Ian is recognised internationally as an authority in the space of podiatry. He's published work in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, the Journal of Foot and Ankle Research, and the Journal of the American Podiatric Medical Association. He's been a podiatrist at the 2012 London Olympic Games, and he's about to embark on a PhD. And Ian and I do a very deep dive into all things foot orthoses, or in common parlance, foot orthotics. Now, we discuss, do they have a place in sports medicine? Who are they for? What may they do? The mechanisms by which they work, and the now debunked mechanisms known to not apply to the role of foot orthoses. And here's a little snippet of my conversation with Ian Griffiths.
The most commonly used term is orthotics. That's the term that patients use the most. It's the term that you see in the magazines the most. Orthotics, not a phrase I'm a huge fan of. Orthotics is essentially the entire profession that governs the issue of orthoses. And we should state at this point that we're talking about foot orthoses, but orthoses can be applied to any part of the body, as I'm sure you know, the wrist, the neck, etc. Knee braces, they all come under under the umbrella term orthoses. So when we're talking about foot orthoses, they are one of many orthoses.
So you're not going to want to miss Ian Griffiths on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show. And look into the horizon beyond Ian Griffiths. We'll be serving you up some further fantastic expert editions, including a deep dive on all things bone stress injuries and recovery, energy availability and nutrition for endurance athletes, special considerations for the female athlete. There's so much more coming up on the Physical Performance Show, so stay tuned. Until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.